William Clark bent over a map that became less certain the farther west his finger moved. Near the Mississippi, rivers gathered in dark, confident lines. Along the lower Missouri, earlier travelers had left names, distances, and fragments of measured country. Then the paper began to hesitate. Some waterways ended abruptly. Mountain ranges appeared as uncertain ridges. Large spaces contained little more than possibility. Yet beyond the page, smoke was rising. Footpaths crossed the prairie. Canoes followed river roads. Villages traded food, horses, tools, stories, and warnings across distances the expedition had never traveled. Rivers that seemed unfinished on American maps already had names. Routes unseen by Lewis and Clark could be described by people who knew where they climbed, where they flooded, and who lived beyond them. The map was incomplete. The land was not. Lewis and Clark carried some of the best geographical information available to American officials. Their maps already contained knowledge gathered from traders, surveyors, earlier explorers, and indigenous sources. But every line grew less certain toward the west. When the expedition reached the edge of its knowledge, who would tell it what came next? The Corps of Discovery moved with boats loaded with weapons, trade goods, scientific instruments, journals, medicine, food, and tools. It also carried uncertainty. Thomas Jefferson's government wanted a practical route toward the Pacific, geographical and scientific knowledge, commercial opportunities, diplomatic contact with indigenous nations, and a stronger American presence in the recently acquired territory. Lewis and Clark were expected to measure the country and extend American claims into it. The Missouri did not welcome them. Its current pressed against the boats day after day. Sandbars shifted beneath muddy water. Wind turned broad reaches rough. Equipment broke, insects gathered, and supplies had to be protected from sudden rain. Sometimes the men rowed. Sometimes they pushed with poles. Sometimes they climbed onto the bank, seized long ropes, and dragged the boats upstream while mud closed around their boots. York worked among them, hauling, hunting, traveling, and facing the same river and weather while remaining legally enslaved to William Clark. Around him labored soldiers, boatmen, hunters, interpreters, and craftsmen whose work kept the expedition moving. The journey would become famous through the names of two captains, but it advanced through many hands. The river was their road. It was also the force trying to send them backward. Clark measured bends, islands, tributaries, and distances as the Corps moved. He protected his papers from water and returned to them when camp grew quiet. A line lengthened. A river mouth appeared. An island took shape where an older map had shown nothing. Then smoke would rise beyond a bend. A narrow path would enter the grass. Tracks would cross the riverbank. The country ahead was not waiting for the expedition to give it meaning. Often, news traveled faster than the boats. Hunters, traders, and families carried information between communities. By the time the Corps approached a village, people farther upstream might already know that strangers were coming with a large boat, flags, weapons, medals, and unfamiliar goods. The expedition believed it was moving toward people it had never met. Those people might already be discussing what its arrival meant. Each meeting entered a different political world. The nations along the Missouri had their own languages, territories, alliances, rivalries, and trade interests. A promise welcomed by one community might appear dangerous to another. Lewis and Clark carried speeches from a distant government and medals bearing the image of a president. They spoke of American trade and new political relationships. The people listening made their own calculations. Would these strangers return? Would their traders strengthen an ally or arm a rival? What did American claims mean in lands governed through older relationships? The Corps needed food, directions, safe passage, and future contacts. The nations it met were deciding whether the expedition offered opportunity, danger, or promises too distant to trust. Every bend in the river led not merely into new terrain, but into another network of human obligations. And those could be harder to cross than the water. Whenever the Corps met someone familiar with the country ahead, questions began. Where did a tributary lead? How far away were the next villages? Where might horses be found? What stood beyond the mountains? Answers could be drawn in soil, measured in days of travel, or carried through several languages before reaching Lewis and Clark. They did not always agree. A direction might be misunderstood. A distant river could be placed incorrectly. Political interests might shape a warning or description. The captains compared what they heard with existing maps, traders' reports, their own observations, and information gathered through interpreters. A measured bend might confirm one account and challenge another. A route described from memory might fill a space no instrument could yet reach. The map emerging from the expedition was not a single discovery. It was an argument assembled on paper. By autumn, the days shortened and the wind sharpened. The Missouri carried the expedition north toward a place that would transform its understanding of everything ahead. In October 1804, the Corps reached the Mandan and Hidatsa Earth Lodge villages near the Missouri and Knife Rivers. After months of difficult travel, the site challenged any idea that the expedition had reached an untouched edge of the continent. Large earth lodges stood in established settlements. Food had been stored for winter. Fields had produced corn, beans, squash, and other crops. Horses and dogs moved among people accustomed to trade and travel. Goods and information passed through the villages from distant regions. Families, traders, and political relationships connected them to nations the Corps had not met and country it had never seen. The Corps had not arrived at the end of civilization. It had reached a regional center. The villages offered food, trade, and access to knowledge about the West. They also offered a place near which the expedition could survive the winter. The relationship was not simple. Mandan and Hidatsa communities observed the newcomers while the captains attempted diplomacy, made promises, and gathered information. Both sides considered what the other might provide. The expedition began building Fort Mandan nearby. Trees were cut. Walls rose. Rooms took shape within the enclosure as colder weather settled over the prairie. Then winter closed around them. Snow covered the ground. The Missouri froze into a pale road of ice. Smoke rose from the fort and from the nearby villages, separate columns climbing into the same hard sky. Inside Fort Mandan, clothing and equipment were repaired. Hunters moved into the cold. Traders visited. Food and messages crossed between the fort and earth lodges. Translation was often difficult. Meaning passed from one language into another, sometimes through several speakers. A name, distance, or direction could change before Clark placed it on paper. Still, the information accumulated. Beside fires, people described rivers, hunting regions, neighboring nations, and routes farther west. Clark added possible waterways, mountain country, distances, and uncertainties to the expedition's working maps. Some lines came from direct measurement. Others came from people who had traveled where the Corps had not. The farther west those conversations moved, the less certain the details became. But the knowledge did not disappear. People in the villages could describe nations beyond the expedition's route. They knew where trade reached the plains, where travel became difficult, and where horses might be found. One name became increasingly important: the Shoshone. The expedition learned that Shoshone people possessed horses. That fact changed the future of the journey. Lewis and Clark had hoped the Missouri might bring them close to an easy connection with waters flowing toward the Pacific. But the country described beyond Fort Mandan suggested something more difficult. At some point, the river road would narrow. Then it would end. Boats could not cross mountains. The Corps would need horses, food, routes, and cooperation from people who understood land no American instrument could explain on its own. The captains began looking for interpreters who might help them reach the Shoshone. Among the people living near the villages was Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trader who spoke Hidatsa and knew the region. With him was Sacagawea. She was a young Lemhi Shoshone woman living among the Hidatsa and pregnant when Lewis and Clark encountered her. Charbonneau was considered for the next stage as an interpreter. Sacagawea's language and connection to the Shoshone might become important farther west. Their infant son would later travel with them. She was not the single guide who would lead the expedition across the continent. No one person could do that. The journey ahead would depend on a chain of knowledge, descriptions gathered at the villages, interpreters able to carry meaning between languages, Shoshone people willing to provide horses, and guides who knew mountain routes and western rivers. Sacagawea was one connection within that chain. But it was a connection the expedition might soon need. Outside, the frozen Missouri continued west beneath snow and darkness. Inside the fort, Clark studied a page containing more than it had at the beginning of the journey. New rivers. Possible routes. The locations of nations. Distances measured through travel and memory. Uncertainties written beside confident lines. The page carried Clark's hand, but not only Clark's knowledge. Part came from what the Corps had measured. Part came from traders and interpreters. Much came from people whose homelands filled the spaces American officials had struggled to describe. Beyond Fort Mandan, the Missouri continued toward country no member of the Corps had seen. Beyond the river, human voices pointed toward the mountains. Beyond those mountains, the expedition hoped to find waters leading toward the Pacific. But instruments could not provide horses. Courage could not translate a language. A compass could show direction without revealing which path could feed a hungry crew. To continue, Lewis and Clark would need more than determination. They would need people willing to share what they knew. And they would need to recognize when their own assumptions were wrong. The expedition believed it was preparing to enter the unknown. But somewhere beyond the frozen river, the path already existed in human memory. The map had ended. The knowledge had not. Spring reached the Missouri as a sound. Ice cracked beneath the warming sky. Dark water opened between white plates, and the frozen river began grinding against its banks as winter moved east. At Fort Mandan, supplies were divided. The keelboat would return downriver carrying reports, letters, maps, scientific specimens, and records from the expedition's first year. The permanent party would continue west in smaller boats. Clark wrapped journals and working maps against water. Food, medicine, tools, weapons, and trade goods were distributed among the vessels. Mandan and Hidatsa people watched the preparations. When the expedition departed in April 1805, the keelboat turned east with part of its accumulated knowledge. The smaller boats pointed west with the rest. About 33 people continued, the captains, soldiers, hunters, boatmen, York, Toussaint Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and her infant son, Jean-Baptiste. Sacagawea was not an all-knowing guide to every country ahead. Much of the route was unfamiliar to her too. But she carried languages, memories, and connections no instrument could replace. Charbonneau's knowledge of Hidatsa also made him valuable, even when his judgment was uncertain. Their family traveled within an armed government expedition, the young mother carrying her child as the boats fought the returning current. The Missouri remained difficult. Sandbars shifted beneath opaque water. Branches caught against hulls. Wind crossed the open river without warning. In May, a sudden gust struck one vessel and forced it onto its side. Water poured in. Cargo shifted toward the river while the people aboard struggled to regain control. Papers, medicine, instruments, trade goods, and supplies began sliding into the water. Sacagawea remained near the threatened cargo. She gathered items within reach and pulled them back as the boat was steadied. She did not save the entire expedition alone. But she acted while valuable materials were disappearing, preserving objects that might otherwise have been lost downstream. The vessel was brought upright. Wet bundles were opened and examined. Then the Corps continued west. Farther upstream, information gathered during winter became visible. The Yellowstone River entered the Missouri from the south. The expedition had never stood at this confluence before, but Mandan and Hidatsa knowledge had already told them to expect a major river in this country. Now a place first carried through another person's memory appeared before the boats. The descriptions had not provided exact measurements. They had provided something equally necessary, an expectation against which the real landscape could be tested. In June, the expedition reached a greater uncertainty. Two substantial rivers divided the country ahead. The northern branch carried paler, muddier water and would later be called the Marias River. The southern branch approached from another direction with a darker current. Both looked large enough to be the Missouri. The expedition's maps could not settle the question. Many members of the Corps believed the northern branch resembled the river they had followed for more than a year. Lewis and Clark believed the southern branch was correct. The disagreement was not caused by inexperience. The evidence itself was uncertain. Choosing wrongly could waste weeks, consume provisions, and carry the expedition away from the Shoshone and the horses it needed. The captain sent reconnaissance parties along both waterways. When the scouts returned, doubt remained. Lewis and Clark chose the southern branch. The boats moved forward while every bend tested the decision. Then Lewis went ahead with a small party. A distant roar reached him across the plains. It grew stronger. At last, the land opened and the Missouri dropped in a vast white cascade. The Great Falls confirmed the route. Indigenous descriptions had led the expedition to expect a major waterfall on the Missouri. The information was not a precise map, but the feature was unmistakable. For a moment, the discovery felt like triumph. Then Lewis saw what surrounded it. The first fall was only part of a long series of cascades and rapids. The expected portage would not be short. The boats could go no farther. Everything had to leave the river. The Corps unloaded cargo and raised the heavy vessels onto improvised wooden wheels and hauling frames. Heat pressed over the exposed ground. Sudden storms turned soil into mud. Sharp vegetation caught at clothing, and rough slopes forced people to drag the same loads over the same route again and again. York hauled beside the soldiers and boatmen, enduring the same labor while remaining enslaved to Clark. Lewis searched for the best route. Clark managed the movement of supplies and preserved the expedition's records. Sacagawea crossed the difficult ground while caring for Jean-Baptiste. The Missouri continued below them, close enough to hear but useless as a road. The portage consumed far more time and strength than expected. Correct information had brought them to the falls. It could not make the falls smaller. During this period, Sacagawea became seriously ill. Her condition brought practical uncertainty and human concern. She was a young mother weakened during one of the journey's hardest stages, and the expedition's medicine offered no certain answer. Without her, future communication with the Shoshone might also become more difficult. She recovered enough to continue. Above the falls, the boats returned to water. But the Missouri itself was changing. The great river narrowed as the mountains drew closer. Channels became shallower, and progress against the current demanded increasing effort. At the Three Forks, the water divided again. Lewis and Clark named the branches Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin. The Corps followed the Jefferson River southwest. Boats scraped through small channels. Men waded beside them and pulled against the current. The river road was approaching its end. Then Sacagawea recognized a formation rising over the landscape. Beaver Head Rock. Its shape recalled a place from her earlier life and indicated that they were approaching the homeland of the Lemhi Shoshone. For the captains, the recognition reduced uncertainty. The Shoshone might be near. So might the horses the expedition could no longer continue without. A feature that meant little to outsiders became a direction through personal memory. Lewis went ahead with a small party to search for the Shoshone. He crossed the continental divide through Lemhi Pass. For years, American hopes had imagined that the western mountains might hide a manageable connection between river systems, a short carry from the Missouri headwaters to water flowing toward the Pacific. Lewis climbed expecting an answer. Beyond the divide, ridge followed ridge into the distance. There was no broad western river waiting below. No gentle descent where boats could be launched after a brief portage. Only more mountains. The simplest version of the expedition's plan collapsed in silence. Lewis could measure his position. He could describe the ranges before him. He could not create a water route where none existed. The Corps would need horses. It would need trails. And it would need people who knew which mountain routes could be crossed. Lewis and his party soon encountered Lemhi Shoshone people. The meeting required caution from both sides. The Shoshone had their own reasons to distrust armed strangers entering their territory. Horses were essential to their security and survival, not spare objects waiting to be handed to travelers. Lewis needed animals and geographical information, but communication remained limited. The main party had to arrive. When it did, the expedition's translation chain became visible. Sacagawea could speak with the Shoshone and carry meaning into Hidatsa for Charbonneau. Charbonneau translated into French, and another interpreter could help convey the message to the English-speaking captains. A request for horses passed through several minds before an answer reached Clark's journal. The system was fragile. It was also indispensable. Then Sacagawea recognized Kamiwait, a Lemhi Shoshone leader, as her brother. Years had passed since her separation from her family. The reunion brought a deeply human moment into negotiations already shaped by caution and need. But the family connection did not settle everything automatically. The Shoshone still had to consider their own resources, security, and limited horses. The Corps still had to trade, persuade, and explain where it hoped to go. Trust increased. Negotiation continued. The expedition obtained horses and information about the country ahead. What the Shoshone described was not the route Lewis and Clark had hoped to find. The Salmon River and its canyons did not provide a simple western passage for the entire Corps. The current was difficult, the terrain severe, and the imagined connection to the Pacific impractical. The remaining hope of an easy water route disappeared. The expedition cached supplies and prepared to leave its boats behind. Canoes gave way to horses. Cargo became packs. Riverbanks became mountain trails. The Corps could no longer force the landscape to fit its plan. The plan had to change. A Shoshone guide known to the expedition as Old Toby helped direct the party north toward established routes. His knowledge concerned real places where water, grass, passes, and trails could be found. He led the Corps toward the Bitterroot Mountains and the Lolo Trail. The route already existed. That did not make it easy. The path narrowed along steep ground. Trees blocked distant views. Early snow settled across high ridges, and cold entered wet clothing after dark. Horses struggled beneath loads. Food became scarce. The Corps climbed one ridge only to find another rising beyond it. Progress became a sequence of short, exhausting distances. People, animals, cargo, journals, and instruments all had to remain together. A scattered horse could carry away supplies. A mistaken turn could consume strength the party no longer possessed. Lewis searched ahead. Clark kept the group moving and preserved its geographical record. York hunted and labored beside the others. Sacagawea carried her child through the same cold and difficult country. The trail showed where humans had passed. It did not promise safety. At times, the route seemed reduced to a faint path through trees and snow. Yet it kept the expedition moving west. Eventually, the mountains began to release them. The Corps descended toward the Weippe Prairie and entered the country of the Nez Perce, or Namipu. They arrived exhausted, hungry, and vulnerable. The Nez Perce were an established people with their own communities, leaders, horses, food systems, routes, and political interests. They had to decide how to respond to the strangers emerging from the mountains. The Corps received food, information, and a place to recover. Some unfamiliar foods were difficult for weakened bodies, but strength slowly returned. The Nez Perce knew the rivers ahead and the trails connecting the plateau to the Columbia Basin. They also agreed to care for the expedition's horses while the Corps returned to water travel. Near the Clearwater River, large trees were chosen for dugout canoes. Controlled fire hollowed the trunks while tools cut and scraped the wood. Smoke drifted through camp as hands shaped new vessels for a new river system. The horses were prepared to remain behind in Nez Perce care. Clark adjusted the maps again. The Missouri now ended behind them among mountains. Ahead, water flowed west. When the dugouts were ready, the Corps entered the Clearwater. The change was immediate. After weeks of climbing, the current carried them. The Clearwater joined the Snake and then the Columbia, each river drawing the expedition into broader water. Rapids demanded constant attention. Villages appeared along the banks. Fishing places, portages, canoe routes, and trade corridors revealed a landscape long organized around the rivers. The Corps moved faster now, but not through an unknown corridor. Communities along the water knew the dangerous channels, seasonal fisheries, and routes toward the lower Columbia. Lewis and Clark continued measuring distances, recording tributaries, and adding villages and names to their journals. Observation remained essential. So did information from people who lived beside the current. The air grew wetter as the Corps moved west. Vegetation thickened. The Columbia widened beneath a low sky. At times, the current seemed to hesitate or change direction under the influence of tides arriving from beyond sight. The Pacific was near. Clark's working map now carried a line across plains, up the Missouri, through the headwaters, over mountains, and into the Columbia Basin. On paper, the route appeared continuous. The journey had not been. Boats had become a portage. The broad Missouri had narrowed into streams. Streams had given way to horses. Horses had followed an indigenous mountain trail. Then dugout canoes had returned the Corps to western rivers. At every change, another body of knowledge had become necessary. Mandan and Hidatsa information had pointed them toward the Shoshone. Shoshone horses and geographical knowledge had carried them beyond the Missouri. Old Toby had helped place them on the mountain route. The Nez Perce had allowed them to recover, protected their horses, and helped connect them to the rivers ahead. The captains measured and recorded the route with extraordinary persistence. But they did not produce it from nothing. As the dugouts moved along the lower Columbia, Clark's pages filled with new bends, settlements, currents, and names. Behind them, the horses remained in Nez Perce care. Farther east, descriptions heard beside winter fires had become lines across country the Corps had finally seen. Ahead, beyond rain and widening water, waited the last western edge of the outward journey. The map they would carry home would show one continuous line. The journey itself had been carried by many hands. Ahead, beyond the final bends of the river, the Pacific was changing the air. But they had not reached it yet. The Pacific announced itself before the expedition could see it. The Columbia widened beneath a low gray sky. Its current slowed and shifted as distant tides reached inland. Salt entered the air. Rain crossed the river, fog concealed the horizon, and dense forest crowded the shores. Large canoes moved between settlements whose people understood the channels, fishing places, coastal routes, and dangerous waters that remained uncertain to the Corps. The ocean was close. But the river mouth was not an empty western edge. Chinook and Clatsop communities lived within a coastal world shaped by trade, seasonal food, travel, and political relationships extending beyond the lower Columbia. In November 1805, members of the Corps finally saw the Pacific. The Missouri remained in their bodies as months of rowing and hauling. The Great Falls survived in memories of heavy loads dragged across rough ground. Shoshone horses, mountain snow, Nez Perce country, and the western rivers had all carried them toward this site. Now waves moved beyond the trees. For the expedition, the moment confirmed that a continental crossing had been completed. But another hope had failed. There was no easy commercial water route joining the Missouri to the Pacific. The mountains had broken that imagined passage into portages, trails, horses, and separate river systems. Clark opened his working papers while ocean waves sounded beyond the forest. The western line had reached its destination. The continent had not become simple. The Corps now had to choose where to spend the winter. Several locations around the lower Columbia were considered according to shelter, game, salt, and available food. The captains recorded the preferences of the party. Sacagawea's opinion was included. So was York's. This was not political equality. York remained enslaved, and Sacagawea held no equal position within the government expedition. Yet during this practical decision, two people denied ordinary power were asked where the group should live. The Corps chose the south side of the Columbia, where winter resources appeared more promising. There, in Clatsop country, they built Fort Clatsop. It was not a great fortress, but a small wooden post raised by exhausted people in a forest that rarely dried. Trees were cut, rooms formed, and supplies protected while rain soaked the timber and mud followed every movement. Beyond the walls, Chinook and Clatsop communities continued their own lives. People hunted, fished, traveled, and traded within an established coastal economy. Visitors came to the fort carrying food and goods for exchange. The expedition sometimes judged local prices high. Coastal traders valued their own goods differently. Relations remained mostly peaceful, though bargaining and translation brought tension. Neither side existed merely to satisfy the expectations of the other. Winter settled into rain. Hunters entered the forest. Others made salt, repaired clothing, treated leather, and prepared supplies for the return. Lewis and Clark continued recording weather, plants, animals, settlements, and the geography of the lower Columbia. Clark returned repeatedly to the map. The Missouri crossed the page toward the Great Falls and Three Forks. Lines climbed through mountains, entered the Columbia system, and reached the coast. Some came from measurement. Others came from memory, approximation, traders, older maps, and indigenous descriptions gathered along the route. The outward track looked almost smooth. Nothing in the ink showed a boat tilting toward disaster or a direction passing through several languages before reaching the page. During the winter, news arrived that a whale had stranded along the coast. A party prepared to travel toward it, interested in obtaining useful material and seeing more of the shore. Sacagawea wanted to go. Her interest mattered beyond interpretation or geography. She had crossed an extraordinary distance while caring for her infant son and had reached an ocean she had never seen before. She joined the journey toward the coast. The moment did not transform her into a symbol. It allowed her to be curious. By March 1806, the Corps was ready to leave Fort Clatsop. Rain still fell. Canoes were loaded. Maps and journals were wrapped again. The small post and its remaining furnishings were left to Sacagawea, a Clatsop leader who had treated the expedition hospitably. The Corps was eager to return east. But the journey home would not be a simple reversal. Moving upstream against the Columbia required paddling, hauling, and portages. Trade goods were wearing out, making exchanges more difficult. Communities along the river held their own ideas about property, payment, and passage. Some encounters remained cooperative. Others became tense. The Corps recognized places it had seen while traveling west, but every rapid now faced them from the opposite direction. Horses became necessary again. The expedition returned to Nez Perce country and recovered the animals left in Namipu care. That earlier trust had preserved the means of crossing the mountains a second time. But snow still blocked the route. Lewis and Clark wanted to continue. Nez Perce knowledge warned that the high country was not yet passable. An early attempt confirmed it. Deep snow stopped progress, and the Corps withdrew to wait. Urgency could not change the season. When conditions improved, Nez Perce guides helped lead the expedition across the mountain route. Familiar ridges and camps could now be anticipated, and eventually the barrier opened toward Travelers' Rest. There, Lewis and Clark divided the expedition. Separate groups could gather more geographical information before reuniting farther east. Lewis would explore toward the Marias River and northern plains. Clark would travel toward the Yellowstone. The decision showed greater confidence, but it also increased risk. Each group would depend upon its own supplies, judgment, and knowledge of the country ahead. Clark traveled with Sacagawea, Charbonneau, Jean-Baptiste, York, and part of the Corps through open mountain country. Sacagawea's memory helped identify a practical corridor connecting the Missouri headwaters toward the Yellowstone. She did not discover an unknown pass. She recognized a route people already used. Clark recorded it as the group moved toward the Yellowstone, which became their next river road. Along its banks, he reached the sandstone formation later called Pompey's Pillar, named for Jean-Baptiste, whom Clark called Pomp. Clark carved his own name into the rock. That inscription remains a physical trace of the expedition. But it was not the first human mark there. Indigenous histories and markings already belonged to the place. Clark's name became one newer layer upon a landscape that had carried meaning long before his arrival. Farther north, Lewis's journey took a darker turn. His party encountered pagan Blackfeet men. The meeting began with communication and a shared camp. It ended in violence after conflict over weapons and horses. 2 Blackfeet men were killed. The episode was brief and tragic, shaped by fear, political tension, and decisions made under pressure. It cannot be reduced to simple aggression from one side or innocence from the other. Not every meeting survived misunderstanding. Lewis and Clark's groups eventually reunited. Then the Missouri carried them east. For more than a year, the current had resisted every westward mile. Now it drew the boats toward familiar country. Bends once uncertain were recognized. Tributaries had positions in the journals. Home could be imagined again. The Corps returned to the Mandan and Hidatsa settlements and the former Fort Mandan area. There, Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and Jean-Baptiste ended their participation in the expedition. There was no grand public farewell. The family remained while the Corps continued downriver. Clark expressed interest in Jean-Baptiste's future, but the boy's later life lay beyond the journey. Sacagawea's own later history remains uncertain in important ways. Her documented contributions were already enough. She had traveled with her infant across rivers, plains, and mountains. She had preserved valuable materials during the boat incident, recognized places, helped communication with the Shoshone, and contributed knowledge at critical moments. She had never guided every mile. She had been one essential person within a larger chain. York continued toward St. Louis. He had hunted, hauled, crossed mountains, participated in encounters, and endured the same dangers as the rest of the Corps. The journey did not make him free. He returned as Clark's enslaved servant, still denied legal control over his own life. Evidence about his later years is incomplete and sometimes contradictory. The expedition had relied on his labor. The society awaiting him still denied his independence. In September 1806, the Corps reached St. Louis. The boats came downriver with the current. A familiar settlement appeared after more than 2 years away, and people gathered near the water as news spread that the expedition had returned. Maps survived. So did journals, specimens, measurements, and records of the route. Lewis and Clark had managed an extraordinary expedition. They preserved observations, made difficult decisions, improved American geographical knowledge, and demonstrated that a continental crossing was possible. They also returned with proof that the hope for simple water passage did not exist. The celebration was not the end of the journey's influence. A voyage ends when travelers return. A map continues moving. In the years that followed, Clark assembled field notes, measurements, sketches, river bends, mountain ranges, settlements, and names into a larger geographical image. His cartographic work was a genuine achievement. He transformed incomplete and sometimes inconsistent information into a picture far more detailed than the one carried west in 1804. Its lines came from different sources. Some came from Clark's measurements, Lewis's observations, and the records of the Corps. Others drew upon earlier maps, traders' reports, indigenous descriptions, remembered routes, and places reached with local guidance. No one can identify the origin of every curve or name with certainty. The map combined observation, interpretation, and approximation. It was influential. It was not perfect. Versions of the expedition's geographical work entered published maps, including the famous map associated with the 1814 account. Readers could follow the Missouri toward its headwaters, see complex mountain systems where earlier maps had suggested simpler barriers, and trace the Columbia toward the Pacific. The route appeared whole. The map preserved relationships among major rivers, the expedition's track, and the approximate locations of many nations and settlements. Some indigenous names entered the paper through translation and uncertain spelling. It gave American officials, traders, travelers, and later mapmakers a geographical structure they had not previously possessed. Yet paper preserved only part of the journey. It could mark Beaverhead Rock without holding Sacagawea's memory. It could draw a mountain route without showing Old Toby choosing the path or Nez Perce guides judging the snow. It could name a nation without recording its interests, debates, or reasons for helping, trading, resisting, or waiting. The clean line concealed human uncertainty. The map also served purposes beyond science. Better geographical knowledge supported trade, for companies, military planning, government claims, migration, surveys, and settlement. Lewis and Clark did not cause everything that followed. But their work made Western homelands more accessible to an expanding United States. For indigenous nations, being mapped did not guarantee recognition, safety, or authority over how their lands would be used. The same map could be several things at once. A scientific achievement. A record of cooperation. A tool of national ambition. A source of future pressure on the people whose knowledge had helped create it. Over time, the expedition became associated most strongly with two names: Lewis and Clark. Those names belong in the story. The captains led the Corps, made critical decisions, preserved journals, recorded observations, and shaped the map that followed. But two names could not contain the entire journey. Behind them stood soldiers, hunters, boatmen, craftsmen, and interpreters. York, Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and Jean-Baptiste. Mandan and Hidatsa people who described Western country beside winter fires. Lemhi Shoshone people who traded horses and explained the mountains. Old Toby. Nez Perce communities who fed the exhausted Corps, protected its horses, and guided its return. Chinook, Clatsop, and other river communities who understood tides, fisheries, channels, and trade routes. The familiar title made the expedition easy to remember. It also made much of its human structure easy to forget. Imagine the finished map lying across a table. The eye moves from the Mississippi to the Missouri, past the Yellowstone, toward the Great Falls and Three Forks, across the mountains to the Clearwater, Snake, and Columbia, then west to the Pacific coast. The route appears as one continuous mark. Beyond the ink lies the real journey. Ropes tightening against heavy boats. Hooves moving along mountain trails. Rain striking Fort Clatsop. Smoke rising above earth lodges. Voices carrying meaning through several languages. Hands drawing temporary routes in soil. people living within every space the map claimed to reveal. Lewis and Clark crossed the continent. Their leadership, endurance, observations, and map-making mattered. But they did not reveal a world without names or history. They entered an existing geography of nations, paths, memories, and knowledge. The map became fuller because many people contributed to the journey. The blank space had become a map. But the land had never been blank. Lewis and Clark had crossed the continent. They had not crossed it alone.